Hello, so welcome to the latest Constraint Collective podcast. I'm happy to i- introduce my friend and colleague Mike Maloney, who I've known for 10 years now, I'd
A
say.
couple more now since
Maybe
2012.
longer.
Yeah, well, maybe even longer than that. 2012 was my honours year with you, but undergrad a
Okay.
couple of years before that, I think, when we first properly met.
Yeah. So I think Mike's got an interesting story. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. He's done some fantastic work and heavily involved now in AIS and working with the university down in Canberra. So you're in Canberra now, Mike. How's it down there?
I think it's a bit better than Brisbane at the moment, so no complaints weather-wise. But yeah, just thanks for having me on. It's good to connect and good to have a chat. And I'm not able to keep up with all the podcasts you guys are putting out, but I've enjoyed the ones I've been able to listen to.
Excellent stuff. Yeah, so just to set in context, I'm in Queensland, in Brisbane. We're 24 hours from a Category 2 cyclone hitting us. So we've it's been put sort of delayed. The cyclone slowed down a little bit, so we managed to get this in tonight before we potentially lose internet tomorrow. I suppose without further ado, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I'm Michael Maloney. I'm currently a joint appointment between the AIS, the Australian Institute of Sport, and the University of Canberra. So on the AIS side, I'm the National Skill Acquisition Network lead, and on the Uni Canberra side, I'm just a skill acquisition, motor control academic researcher. So my role at the AIS involves coordinating, supporting I guess, a network of skill acquisition practitioners across our system. When I say system, I mean Australia as a country, because we are a federated country. We have skill acquisition specialists employed in different state institutes around the place. So my role really is to try and connect them, share practice, avoid duplication, run or lead projects relevant to, hot topics or something like that. And that's a bit of a from me, because before that, I've been a practitioner, a skill acquisition practitioner and researcher, applied researcher for probably the last decade before that. So yeah, I'm very much shifted gears from working alongside coaches and athletes to now more so working with and supporting skill acquisition practitioners and their development.
So it's a bit. I think it's a really interesting journey. What got you interested in skill acquisition in the first place, Mike?
I feel like that's a planted question, but I think I was it was yourself and Keith. I think I was just
I
fortunate
wasn't,
enough.
honestly, that wasn't the case, but carry on.
I think I was just fortunate enough to come through QT at right place, right time. I was doing a sports science degree. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I was coaching part time on the side just at a local high school, and I was going to these skill act lectures, and they began to resonate with me because I'd come to the lecture in the morning, and then the afternoon when I was coaching, I'd be trying out these things I'd learned in the morning lecture, and I began to really enjoy it and develop a bit of a passion for it. And I started to, I think I took every possible skill act elective I could. I think I took a few PE ones and things like that with you guys, and there's probably not an undergraduate degree in the world, or there's probably not someone who did an undergraduate degree in the world who did three skill act subjects. So um, that was
Yeah.
really where it started.
What were you coaching at the time?
Anything and everything, like one of those like high school jobs where you don't earn too much money, but you earn enough to pay for beer and Skittles and those sorts of things. So I'd coached everything. I coached cricket, I coached rugby, I coached some basketball as well.
That was that so you talk about doing the lectures in the morning or the workshops in the morning and having a go at it in the afternoon. How was your first experience of trying to coach using more of a constraint-led approach than I guess than you'd been probably exposed to before or used to from the environment that you were in? How did that go?
Yeah, well, I actually remember it. I have this vivid memory of uh, like for some reason it was during cricket season, so it would have been semester one at the university, and I have this memory of our team on the weekend didn't play spin very well. Like I think it was only like an under 12s team or something like that. And when it gets tossed up to them, sometimes they don't. The batters don't handle it that well. And and so I thought, oh, I'm gonna do some practice activities that expose them to a bit more spin and potentially explore some ways that support them to explore some ways that they can actually bat against it. And I think one of the things we tried to do is get them to use the crease a bit more, use their feet a little bit more, get to the pitch of it, that sort of stuff. And I remember using my words, and it just wasn't that successful.
Yeah.
And I think I might have even chatted to you about it. I can't remember, but the next session I just took some cones down, and all essentially they had to do was get their feet out past these cones. So it wasn't necessarily like an elegant solution, and I
Yeah.
probably look cringe it a little bit now because you're potentially forcing some solutions. But I found it a really powerful way. I think that's where it was introduced to me as a really powerful way to change behavior and encourage exploration, because all of a sudden you're forcing them to get out of the crease and begin to start exploring what moving down and getting to the pitch of the ball could actually look like. And it was so much more powerful than just using my instructions.
I'm going through the same problem at the moment. I've got a year 18 who play spin quite poorly, and the key problem is the size. So physically they're not strong enough to hit the ball with vertical bat shots. They can't hit down the ground. So that transfer of weight is a crucial um, idea of trying to get them to hit through the ball. And I think for me the biggest problem is that majority of their cricket has been played on artificial surfaces.
Mm.
So they get a lot of balls that bounce high and short in their club cricket. And then so they're very good at horizontal bat shots where you can use your whole body, of course. But then they're coming up against some really good players in the competition that they're playing in at the moment who don't give them
Mm.
those balls, and it's on turf. So
Mm.
it's become a real challenge of trying to find a
Mm.
way of helping them. So I'm going through the same problem of you. Nothing's
Yeah.
changed. Same problem that
Yeah,
you've got.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a common one, isn't it? But yeah, I'd say that was the first time, and that's probably something that's held true throughout my career as a practitioner as well. Like I remember, times I've worked with sports or with skills that I've really struggled to shift or change. As we're working alongside a coach, it's often because it's a really difficult task to use constraints on. Well, like I'll be really happy if I never have to work with the volleyball spike again, because like it's actually it's such a complex skill when you do a task analysis on it. Like you're running in, you're jumping, you're trying to coordinate your actions and your movements to the what's happening on the other side of the net, potentially what's happening with your teammates who are passing or setting to you, and then coordinate this big run in, jump, and huge spike to a ball, this small object that's going through the air, and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
an activity that it's a really common skill that coaches need to refine in volleyball due to back injuries or trying to get more power, those sorts of things. But it's a really difficult skill to work on, because using constraints on that skill is actually a really difficult thing to do because it's so dynamic. So we often lean towards using feedback practices and video feedback and stuff. And it's always such a struggle to make the shift without being able to use constraints.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to that because I know that's a little bit. The volleyball was in the last few years, but before that, so you finished with us. You said I can't even remember what your honors was, to be honest. What did you do your honors on? Remind me.
Uh, Long jump run ups.
Oh, of course.
Um,
So
yeah,
you
with
worked
Dan.
with QAS.
Yeah, with Dan Greenwood at the Queensland Academy of Sport. So that was my first real exposure to, I think,
I
high performance sport, and I think
do. remember that now. Yeah. So tell us about that study because I think that was really quite interesting. Now I remember it.
Yes, so that one, that was working with the long jump, the Jumps Center of Excellence at the QAS, and it was just interested in the role of information and how that supported gait regulation in the run up. It was a really simple, honest study, but I think it was a really great one. So we just manipulated the presence of board markers and the judge. Like when you're running up as a long jumper in competition, you have little board markers like witches hats or something like that on either side of the board because your run up actually can start from 40 or 50 meters away, and you sometimes might not be able to see the board. So you actually have these little markers that indicate it to you. And um, just by the nature of sometimes training setups, it's that stuff's not always present there because sometimes you just don't have the equipment or you forget or it's too hard. And so we're lucky we had a really curious and clever coach at the time who was just interested in, is it actually important to have this stuff present in training? And so my study or our study just looked at what happens when you practice your run ups and jumps with and without that information present. And we found that long jumpers were beginning to steer and regulate their gait from the very beginning when that information was there. And when it wasn't there, they didn't start steering until really late. And so it was really actually important that it was there because with long jump, you want to maintain as much velocity and momentum as you can. And that means small adjustments over the length of the approach as opposed to these big stutter steps at the end, which obviously you lose all your momentum and you don't jump as far.
That was very similar findings to our cricket study in my PhD, where I remember when we found through the way that we analyzed it that we got changes in step regulation as and when they needed it. But typically with fast bowlers, it was at the beginning of the run up and at the end of the run up. And in the middle, they just sort of cruise because they didn't want to lose that momentum and lose that speed. But I remember
Mm,
one of the viewers in one of our first papers going, how can they regulate? They can't see, surely they can't see the line. It's just a very
mm,
line, but the stumps, when they're 30, 40 meters away, how can they be regulating? And that was our key point there was that there's a person standing in that area who gives you that information. It gives you that
mm,
feedback. And then later
mm,
we worked with and Dan Greenwood as well, where we took the umpire away and it changes the run up. So similar
mm.
to the work in long jumping, this preserving the key information is pretty crucial, even if we're practicing in that situation, I think. Yeah, that's really
Yeah,
good.
and I think Dan's PhD in this space was great too. Like I think being able to leverage and harness the coach experiential knowledge in that space too. Like in that program, they had one of the world's best long jump coaches, and he had these ideas about this, which were also sat alongside scientific literature in that space, like your cricket work and things like that, which he obviously as a coach probably hadn't read, but he had these ideas and thoughts from his own experience as a coach and knew this stuff was important. So like I always look back on that time as actually important for my own development in terms of understanding the importance and the credibility I think of coach knowledge as well.
I think that's a really good point, is that Keith always talks about this sort of Venn diagram of the overlap between, the experiential knowledge and the scientific knowledge or the theoretical knowledge, and the bit in the middle is the key bit.
Mm,
But it also emphasizes that, coaches look, they don't do things for the sake of it most of the time. They've learned these things. And therefore, the scientists or the people working with coaches really have to respect the coach's knowledge and the coach's experience. And I know we really try and sort of promote that rather than working. You work with the coach, don't you? I think that's always been the idea in the work is you
yeah,
co-create, just like the coach co-creates with the athletes, the scientist co-creates with the coach for the athletes.
yeah, yeah. And there's like I think we're realizing the importance of that now too. Like there's this really great quote that I've been using recently from it's from Raoul. Ojan's, and I think it's in the para book that Joe Baker and Ross Pinder led, and
Mm.
you know, it's talking about knowledge about motor learning or motor control is like we're just learning now. It's actually not enough. You actually need to also have knowledge around and processes to collaborate and co-create and work with coaches too. And he's got a really nice quote about that in that book, which is potentially worth a read for people.
All right, maybe we'll find that and put it in the show notes. Um, I think that's what you're supposed to say when you do it. So there's another part. I think this was you with that study, where we looked at task simplification in terms of reducing the length of the run up. So clearly, demanding physiologically and demanding long jump if you run off a full run up, and the potential for injury if you run on a full run is means you can't do too many full run ups. So typically coaches reduce the length of the run up. And I remember I can see some graphs in my head of what happened when we reduced the length of the run up and whether it was actually task simplification or task decomposition, I think was our discussion. So can you remember?
Yeah, yeah. There's and I think this is again a really nice example of that coach knowledge and um, the fact that experiential knowledge is actually really important and really to be respected by coaches. Because if you just came into this program and looked at what they were doing without the context or understanding, like as a skill acquisition specialist, I looked at a lot of what he did to begin with, and I'm like, a lot of this training is not representative, or it's really removed from competition, and you really quickly realize that they can't actually do their full approach and jump that often, like just for load purposes. So they actually don't do that many attempts of it. But the coaches really cleverly got these modified activities that they can use to supplement that essentially and still train some of the key skill elements. And, Gary, the coach, had worked out that, I can probably do about a 10-step approach. And he's like, that gets us to about 90% of the velocity. And he's like, potentially it's even got greater gait regulation and steering demands than the full approach because you've got to do it shorter. So he's like, I think it potentially trains the steering component more as well. But then the ones that we through some of our work, we realized weren't that useful were those decomposed ones where you just do a run through, strike the board, and then just keep running, as opposed to a shortened approach, run and jump. And that was where that nested task became actually really important. The task that's nested on the end, it's all connected and it shapes how you behave before that. And if you've got a jump, you've got greater demand on getting your positioning right on the board compared to if you're just going to keep running through.
I think we look at a 6-step and a 10-step, and I don't think the 6-step reflected the visual regulation as well as the 10-step, which sort of mimicked the full run up, didn't it?
Yeah.
If I remember.
Yeah, and the sixth step, you're just trying to like accelerate and get up to speed, really. And then by the time you're there, it's like, oh, I'm at the board. So you don't really have that as much of the focus on steering as you did with the extra couple of steps where you had time to accelerate and then sight the board.
So what advice would you give to a coach who's coaching of an athletic jumps or anything, any sport where you run up and you complete a nested task at the end? What would your advice be to any of the coaches who are doing that? So like a long jump or a triple or a ball vault or like a cricket bowling task or
Yeah,
whatever.
well, I think it's actually seeing the run up as a key skill, and which is often like the run up can often be neglected, I think, with the emphasis on what's actually happening at the end of it. So I think seeing it as a key skill, but also seeing it as a nested or a coupled skill that's highly interrelated to what you're doing at the end of it as well. I think they'd be the two things. There's still so much more I'd love to do in the run up space. I haven't been very active in that space for a while now, but I think there's all sorts of kind of cool training interventions you could do as well to maybe support developing that steering skill or that kind of capability.
I think that, I mean, a long time before our work, we built on other people's work, didn't we?
Mm.
But you know, the study where you've just got people running and practicing the run up without jumping at the end of it, there's no visual regulation takes place. There's no adjustments made to try and hit a target. So whatever you're doing, you always need a target there. Whether you manipulate the size of that target or whatever, I think is an interesting, as you say, an interesting argument. I can even remember
Yeah.
that not having the windsock there changed the step lengths, didn't it?
Mm.
The step.
Mm. And like and the other one too, I think is the run up length. Like I actually think that that could be a really key thing to manipulate. Like I think you've got to keep the number of steps the same because I think athletes
Yeah.
use the rhythm, but I actually think you can manipulate the length of that run up to encourage steering. Because this was the other really interesting thing from the honors research too. I don't know if you remember this, but we actually looked at the variation of where they started, and there was a huge within athlete standard deviations. So like we had one athlete, like they could potentially move their start marker like up to 2 meters either way, you know,
Yeah.
and just based off the weather or based off how fresh they were feeling that day. So like there's this 4 meter radius that they'd actually naturally without us intervening.
Yeah, I love that because I did a single case study design with a cricket bowler where I had the umpire, a no umpire condition and a no stump condition. Um, because so there was less information, there was just the crease markings there. And he was really interesting when the umpire was there. He wasn't really hung up on where he started. You know, he would start sometimes behind his mark, sometimes in front of his mark. But when I
Mm,
took all the extra information away, he
mm,
made sure that he started on his mark. So you've got this, you know, there's this
mm,
idea that I'm going to repeat, you know, a repeatable action, repeatable run up.
mm,
And it just
mm,
didn't find that, it didn't work in that way. So
mm,
um, Keith always talked to us about no ball problems in cricket, which would be no jump problems in long jumping. And he always said, you know, like if you get in terms of learning to steer, as you describe it, and adjust your step length as you need to, he said, just basically get the player to walk away from the crease and then just say turn and bowl,
mm,
and just vary that all the time.
mm,
And then
mm,
just turn and bowl, and you just come in and your body self-organizes and adjusts to actually hit the crease. And
mm,
then I was doing a session at Loughborough, and I think it was like Kevin Shine, who was the England fast bowling coach at the time, was talking about one of the bowlers who was an England bowler at the time who had a no ball problem. And he said, you know what we do? He said, we get him to walk away and then just turn around and come and bowl. Just turn and bowl. He said, and then just before I'd gone down there, he said, he rang me up and said, I'm having a real problem with my no balls. He said, are you doing your practices? Are you doing your drill? Oh no.
mm.
Ah, okay, go back to do that again. So the coach again, another example of experiential knowledge and the scientists, you know,
Yeah.
coming up with the same solution without really knowing all the science behind it, I guess. But yeah,
Mm.
that was a
And
lovely, lovely idea.
and I think some of the those ideas sound really radical in terms of just turn and run up from wherever you are. But I mean, the reality is we're steering all day, every day as we're walking around and navigating the world, as we're jogging towards the curb and jumping up on that. Like we're actually steering, and we're not necessarily thinking
Yeah.
actively about it. So I think it's just actually recreating or manipulating some
Um,
constraints to encourage, I guess, you know, attuning to those key information sources.
Absolutely. And I've always used that as an example in the lectures around, you know, if you're walking towards the edge of a curb, you don't end up with one foot in the gutter
Mm,
unless you're drunk, you know, like that was always
mm,
the punchline. Occasionally got a laugh. But you end up hitting your foot in the right spot because you
yeah.
visually regulate and self-organize to do that. Um, and you do that subconsciously or unconsciously, whatever words you want to use it, with the intention
Mm,
of not ending up in the gutter. So I think
mm,
you're absolutely right there. but I mean, it's interesting that these ideas still are strongly held beliefs in sport. And you hear cricket commentators all the time when somebody's bowling a no ball, they talk about moving their marker. Well, it's not the marker that's the problem, as we've just described. And I remember just as I was about to submit my PhD, I was having to write the introduction. And I was in New Zealand at the time, and there was a young guy had just come into the New Zealand team. I think his name was Michael Mason. And he's come in his first, on his debut in Test cricket, and he's a fast bowler, starting the innings, and he runs up, and his front foot's in line with the stumps, so he's a crease length behind. He does this two or three times on the trot, and I think Chris Cairns was at mid-on, who's obviously experienced at that time, and the commentator he goes, "There we go, look, the old hand, just moving his marker another, the 3 foot forward, that'll work it all out. He knows what he's doing. Same place in the next run-up, exactly the same place in the run-up." And I use that as an example, as an introduction, as part of my PhD. So
Yeah.
and we always talk about don't move your marker, move the umpire, because the umpire is the reference point of where you take off to jump
Mm,
in cricket. Um,
mm.
so it might be similar things for you in all your jumps as well. But yeah, fascinating. It's amazing. Like such a long time ago, Mike. Now I remember it all. But so when
Yeah.
your honors, you then I think left us. I think you disappeared south and did your PhD, I believe, or was it?
Yeah. So I think before that, was lucky to do an apprenticeship for a year at the AIS as a skill acquisition scholar. So I think it's almost like it's a bit of an apprenticeship program where you get paid a apprentice wage essentially to just shadow and learn from more senior skill acquisition people. So that really continued to foster and deepen my love for the
Who
space.
your mentor there at the time?
So your corridor mate Adam Gorman was my mentor then.
No corridor
Um,
mate anymore. He's got his
yeah,
own corridor.
not sure, but yeah, it was Adam Gorman and Rick Shuttleworth and Damien Farrow at the time.
So quite different characters, different skill sets, I guess. Or what did you so if you had said like Damien was obviously the guru of was known as Mr. Skillak throughout Australia and probably the world. So what did you learn from each of the three of them? Because I know they're very different characters with different skill sets. So tell
Yeah,
us what you learned from each of them.
well, I think Damo had I've heard him talk about this, or he's reflected anyway with me about this. Like I think he was quite purposeful in how he designed that team to ensure there was that diversity of perspective, essentially. Because I think when he hired someone like Rick, um, that was when ecological dynamics and constraints-led approaches were really starting to emerge. And I think that's why someone like like he was, I guess, hired. And then you had someone like Gormo, who's got a PE teaching background, like very hands-on and able to get down into sessions. Like I think the happiest I see Gormo is when he's out there like essentially coaching or running drills with athletes. So like each had their own little, their own things that you'd pick up and take away. Like I love the hands-on nature of Gormo and his ability to relate with coaches and build connection and respect with them and with Rick, like obviously theoretically he's brilliant. So, the opportunity to continue to learn from him around how some of these, because like I was still very early in my career then, how some of these complex theoretical ideas are actually applied in practice. Like both were, really great people to learn off. And then you had Damo, who I think was just so measured and pragmatic about everything, like was just able to, I think, had the connections, had the know-how, just knew how to get things done and how to set those people up to be successful and match them to the right environment. So I was really fortunate at the time.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic experience. And then obviously Canberra was so good to you that you decided to stay there and do your PhD down there. Um,
Yeah,
so
and that was just an opportunity that presented itself with combat sports at the time. They decided to try and invest in it because we're not very good in Australia at combat sports. I think we might have won a handful of medals over the last 20 years, but that's more the exception than the norm. And so skill acquisition was an area that they wanted to try and prioritize. So I spent the next 4 years down there. I guess more of an apprenticeship program. This is probably what we're is really important for the development of specialists in Australia. We're finding is being embedded in a sport whilst being mentored by senior practitioners and also academics at the same time as well.
yeah. So I know you did some great studies as part of that PhD that have really got practical significance as well, and really reinforced the ideas, some of the principles around um, applying the ideas of ecological dynamics and constraint-led approaches. So talk us through some of your studies and probably why did you do this? What was the purpose of the study? Why was the coach interested in it? And, then what did you find out? And what were the implications for coaching?
Yeah, I think this was probably quite serendipitous in that it was coaching, question, and also academic progression kind of aligning. So it was really building on some of John Hedrick's work in effective learning design and also the great work out there in representative design. But the coach was essentially interested in this question of how can we better create pressure in training, because for them the challenge was most of our combat sports are small. They don't have huge budgets, and often our best athletes are in small squads in Australia, and it costs a lot of money to go overseas to compete. And so they spend a lot of time here, and training can be difficult for them to recreate pressure like what they face when they go over to Europe or when they go over to Asia for competition. And so they can often go to these competitions, and I think the pressure of it can often lead to them bowing out early or being a bit overwhelmed. And so the coach was just really interested in how he could design practice activities that would create more effective responses and simulate that pressure in training. And so it was kind of serendipitous in that those two worlds were kind of colliding at the same time. So that was the main justification for I guess the research topic or the PhD thread. And we had a few different studies that explored that.
Yeah. Tell us about I can't remember the order of them, but tell me about the scoreboard study.
Yeah, that was the second study. The first one looked at honestly just it was we call it competition versus training. It just looked at changes in fighting behavior in a legitimate competition versus just a normal fighting sparring or training essentially, just to actually try and understand where the differences were, to help maybe guide what an intervention could potentially look like. And so we employed like a mixed methods approach, and it was quite interesting in a sense. Like there were some really big differences in the way they fought when it was a competition with something on the line against international opponents versus just fighting their mates in training. And so they stood further apart. They
When did they stand further apart?
in training they stood further apart. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and they kicked less. Like the kicks per minute was down, and they also performed less attacking kicks. Like in the study was in Taekwondo, and head kicks get you the most points. They did at the time. And if you're fighting your training partner who's your friend, you don't necessarily always want to kick them in the head. So there was kind of these interacting factors at
Mm,
play, in terms of like behavior, cognition, and affect all kind of interacting. Like it was really difficult to say which one was causing what. You know, is it because they're standing further away that they're reporting lower anxiety? You know, that they're reporting less pressure and those sorts of things, or is it actually because, you know, their cognitions are saying, oh, I'm a bit bored in here. I fight this guy all the time. I know what's going to happen, so I'm a little bit disengaged from the task that you stand further away. And like that further away thing was actually really critical because it's essentially Taekwondo is a game of trying to manage distance between yourself and the other fighter, and you want to find I guess attune to your opponent for when you can actually close that distance and strike and make a kick. And so if you're standing further away, you're not really practicing the true task of the competition, where you're just this little bit closer and you have less time to react, to either defend yourself, or less time to react in terms of attacking as well. So um, I think for me as well, that was quite a pivotal moment for me around the interaction of affect, cognition, and behavior, and it being really difficult to try and pull one out and study something out of context. I think since
I think
I've really lent into more mixed methods approaches to better understand things.
what really nice that study built on Robert Rostovsky's work from boxing that manipulated the distance of the boxer to a punch bag, didn't he? And there was some critical distances that afforded them different um, types of punches. So if you were a long way apart, the IDP, interpersonal distance between the
Mm,
bag and the player was a lot longer. It only afforded you, only invited, or gave you the opportunity to do a jab, because you can only
mm,
reach by doing a jab. But if you're in
yeah,
close, you've got the uppercut and
yeah,
the hook, I guess. And then there's a critical distance where all three types of punches were available, isn't it? So
yeah.
in Taekwondo, if you're a longer distance away, then it only affords certain possibilities. Um,
And and we found that was like it's body scaled as well to the leg length of yourself and the leg length of your opponent too. So it's not just any distance, it's something that's actually scaled to you. And well, it's not just body scaled, it's also action scaled. So how quickly can you potentially close that distance as well? How long's your opponent's leg, but also how powerful are they and how quickly can they close that gap? And so like if anyone's watched Taekwondo, you'll see fighters are really attracted to like these most stable states where getting hit is really tough and that's far away, or it's in really close where you can't kick someone. So they spend like almost all their time there. And you don't want to get stuck in kind of this middle distance, because unlike like boxing's got three, like I think Hitovsky's paper had, you know, three punches. I think with Taekwondo it was like 6 or 7 kicks that were possible. So like you actually really don't want to get stuck in this middle distance because there's a really good chance you're going to get scored on.
yeah. So I remember we had a long discussions, and I don't know whether we ever resolved it, about the value of practicing when the IDP, the interpersonal differences, weren't representative of the ones that you would see you in real competition. And I can't remember what we came up with, but I remember we discussed this for a long time about, is it actually worth bothering? So what did you come up with, or what did the coaches think to that?
Yeah, I think what we ended up working with the coaches on was exploring how we can manipulate it, or manipulate the distance between fighters in the different training activities. So I don't think there's ever training activities that are not necessarily worth doing. It's more so, are they connected and aligned to what you're trying to achieve? And obviously in competition, there's all sorts of interpersonal distances that you'll be exposed to. But I think the idea for us was making sure that people are exposed to a variety of different fighters that have different limb lengths, have different power capabilities in terms of their ability to close distance and things like that. And so that led to a lot more international training partners and training camps and things like that, just to make sure they were getting exposed to that variety in practice, and allowed to actually explore how you can actually manage, essentially that variety of what you will be exposed to.
Yeah, so it's basically repetition without repetition in terms of a competitive opponent, isn't it? And
Mm,
what that opponents offers you. And I think that's a key message for all sports, isn't it? All adversarial sports where it's 1v1, whether that's tennis, badminton, baseball, pitcher, all of those sort of things where two people are against each other. Um,
mm,
and I think, from another level, that's all about being able to identify and pick up the information that your opponent is offering you. What are the clues that they give you
yeah.
in terms of,
And I think one of the great things about like we've got a paper out there as well that just looks at the interpersonal dynamics of taekwondo. So like it just explores interpersonal distance and what it kind of looks like across the course of a fight, and then also what it looks like when fighters close it really quickly and attack. And one of the things that was really noticeable about that distance trace is that fighters are always exploring, like they're always moving, they're always like bouncing up and down on the spot, slightly faking in and out. Like they're always like, if you think about like we move to create information and we use that to create more movement, like it's a perfect example of that. They're constantly like exploring through their actions and looking for that opportunity to attack.
Yeah, I think that's a real crucial point. And some of the guys on our Patreon site are MMA coaches, and they're using some of this stuff incredibly well in their own design. We were talking a couple of weeks about Rob Gray's paper on making deliberate errors. And one of the guys was using, deliberately misses with punches and things like that, so that you begin to recognize and pick up the information that your opponent is offering you. And that's quite a different way of coaching than worrying about the technical side, just, all the internal focus, isn't it? It's all about an outcome and a
Mm,
goal. Yeah,
mm.
really. I mean, it was a lovely PhD, and then there was one study where you put a scoreboard. The manipulation was presence of scoreboard and absence of a scoreboard, wasn't there?
Yeah, and that was they're trying to explore this question if fighting in training doesn't necessarily create enough pressure, well, what are some manipulations that we could explore that could actually do that? And the scoreboard was a really obvious one for us in Taekwondo. Because people haven't watched it, the scoring system, it's not a subjective system. It's actually like as you wear a shield that's got magnets in it, and you wear magnets on your socks, on your feet. And so when you actually connect with the shield, that's how you score points. And it's actually got quite specific ways of scoring in terms of how you have to make contact. It's not in the old days where it was more judge-led subjective scoring. They brought in these shields to make it completely objective, but it's got really big implications for your technique and how you make contact and things like that. But it's a pain in the ass to set up because you got to connect all these wires, bring the TV, your computer out, log in, and all that stuff. And so it was also like a logical question for us to explore. How actually important is it having this there, and how does it change fighting behavior? And aligned really nicely with John Hedrick's work on effective learning design too, which provided a lot of the theoretical rationale for why this could work to create pressure is essentially by adding context to tasks. You start to create these little vignettes and rich scenarios, which people have emotional responses to or engagement with.
Yeah, and perhaps not surprisingly, I think people fought differently when there was a scoreboard, when there wasn't. And I think, if I
Yeah,
remember, one of them was they didn't know what the score was if there was no
yeah,
scoreboard. They thought
yeah, and
they
and,
thought they
and
were
that was
ahead of
where
the.
yeah, and that was also this study shaped a lot of my thinking in the sense too around the role of context, and how that shapes and guides behavior, like the whole skilled intentionality piece, landscape of affordances, et cetera, et cetera. Being skillful is making the right decision at the right time. And context is critical for that. Like you actually need context to determine what a good decision looks like. And so we had fighters who were like, I don't really know what the score is because it's not there. So I'm just kind of gonna explore and do my own thing. And and then as soon as you actually had the score present, like they felt really constrained by it. Like they're like, oh, the score's there. I actually have to fight based on my match
Yeah.
situation. And like it sounds silly, but like it's actually, it's obviously really critical that in practice we expose fighters or players in any sport to all the sorts of contexts and scenarios you're going to experience in a match or a game, because that's the thing that's going to help them develop that that really good decision making.
I've always thought it's, an interesting one with junior sport is that we're not going to keep the score, as a way of reducing
Yeah,
I guess more about parental behavior or coaching behaviors than the kids' behaviors. In terms of, this like we must win type of thing. Like we'll take that
yeah,
out. We're not, and that gets criticized from a perspective of culture war perspective, really, I guess, is, like I remember in New Zealand, a coach, we did a conference, and this coach says, it's not about winning anymore, is it? We're not interested in winning. Isn't this wrong? And all of this. And you're going, okay, well, what is winning? That's another story. But for me, you need the score so that you can learn how to play intelligently.
yeah,
So if you're ahead, you're going to fight differently than if you're
yeah,
behind, or if there's too many, and you need the clock, you need time length in there. You need to
yeah,
know as you said, the context is absolutely crucial to learn how to play the situation.
yeah,
So for that reason, I always think we should keep the score. Like once it's done, the only people bothered afterwards are the parents. The kids don't care. Yeah, they've forgotten and moved on within 10 minutes, most of them anyway, at younger
yeah.
ages. Uh, I think it's always a flawed argument, but there we are.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think that's probably more a constraint to shape parental behavior rather than anything to do with the kids.
I thought the point you made there about the use of the technology has changed the way that you fight is really a good sort of example of changing constraints and how that changing constraint over time can lead to a new way of having to perform. And I think of, other examples where the change of equipment changed the game or changed the nature of it. So the the big mat in high jumping allowed Fosbury to develop his way
Mm,
of in javelin. I think in the 80s, I think it was. And I was going to say Zelezny. I think his name was Zelezny. Was a javelin thrower from one of the Scandinavian countries. Started to throw it out of the stadium. He started to throw it 100 meters, and it became
mm,
problematic to fit it into the stadium and from a
mm.
safety point of view. So they
Yeah,
changed the hopping moment of the
yeah,
javelin, the back,
yeah.
and
And
that led to a change in who was best suited to this new javelin and the way of coaching. But I really like those examples of how the
well,
technique.
it was the same. It was the same in Taekwondo because it used to be judges that would score based off there was a contact element, how good your contact was, but there was also a qualitative, subjective element around how good your technique was. Like, was it a nice looking kick? And all of a sudden, that didn't matter. And so there was this real ugly kick that began to emerge called the rabbit kick, where like you get in really close, you hold your opponent like this, and you just kind of tuck your foot up and try and um,
Yeah.
slap the shield that they're wearing, and it was ugly as all hell. It never would have actually led to a point when it was judge-led scoring, but because of the new system and the way points were awarded now, where it was just magnet on shield, like it was a really nice example of how that change in constraints like led to exploration and new behavior from fighters.
Yeah, so in a lot of traditional sports, people might not think that the technology is really influencing the way that the technical skills that we need to perform. But I think, like example like football, um, when I was a kid growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, we used to play with a football. You get a brand new football, and it was great for a few weeks, and then all the coating would wear off. And then in the Northern Hemisphere, in England, in the winter, the ball would become wet and heavy. So I could never like play a bend a pass with the outside of my foot, and it really frustrated me because you'd watch the Brazilians do it, and I remember going to
Yeah.
Wembley and watching England under 15s play the Dutch, and
Yeah.
I still can see this pass where somebody bent it with the outside of their foot around the defender, and it really frustrated me that I couldn't do that. But funnily enough, in July, when it was in pre-season training and the pitches were rock hard and dry, the balls felt lighter and you could do it. So they weren't
Mm.
wet. So it was only when these coated balls came in did it allow these sorts of techniques to come in that the South Americans have been doing for a long time. The
Mm.
Europeans were allowed to do that. And the
Mm.
other thing is current footballs travel something like 30% further than they did 20% just because of the material. So the game changes. That changes the
Mm.
game.
Mm.
And you think in other sports where a rule change has led to a change in technique or a change in approach, like handball in soccer, like now the way they defend because you can't risk having your arms out, and the way you jump up for a ball, etc. So yeah, I think that's a really nice example of constraints, and that idea of self-organization is
Yeah,
great.
and I think like even the idea of social constraints as well. Like I think that's a huge one that's probably less spoken about too. I included this in my lecture the other day on um, Sam Constas at Boxing Day Test over four versus Bumrah. Imagine if that was Glenn Maxwell 10 years ago doing that. Like he'd never play another game for Australia again. But because Glenn Maxwell walked that path, and T20 happens, that those sorts of shots become more socially acceptable, and all of a sudden you have someone who's relatively celebrated for it.
Maybe, Mike. I'll just
You,
add
you, you
my.
might have your own thoughts on that, but I thought it was like interesting in terms of how the different shots are received by players, 10, 15 years apart.
Definitely, yeah. So culture changes, doesn't it? And the way that the game is played. I remember the World Cup that England lost, which probably about 1989 time in India, and England played Australia in the final, and I mean England, were cruising it. Mike Gatting was cruising the game, and I think Alan Border came on and he tried to reverse sweep him and got bowled, and he was
Mm.
castigated forever for that. So but now a reverse sweep is part of every kid's repertoire. You know, I still see it. I see it with Mike. One of my number 11 came in on Saturday and reverse paddled the spinner for four. He was a number
Yeah,
11, and
yeah,
I'm just going,
amazing.
okay, okay. I'd still like you to hit it back over his head for six at some point, but it does become fashionable and becomes that sort of the game. Yes, the game changes from social expectation and ways of playing as well. I still think you need to be an intelligent performer for me. Don't do it just because it's funky. Do it because it's
Yeah,
effective.
yeah, and that's probably a nice close of the circle around the need to practice in context.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, well, I'll leave that one because maybe I shouldn't
Maybe
go
that can
there.
be for the Patreons.
That one's me and you offline, I think.
Yeah.
So PhD finished. What came next?
Yeah, so I went down to the South Australian Sports Institute. So I finished up with my PhD. Really valuable experience there because you're learning how to work with coaches while you're doing your research. And so went to the South Australian Sports Institute and employed as a full-time skill acquisition specialist.
Yeah. And what sports you were based in Adelaide, and who did you work
Yeah,
most?
so Yeah, so I was really lucky to work under a more senior specialist again. Like I think as I look back on my own development, something that it's been more fortuitous than anything else is, moving to places where I've actually had really great support.
Mm.
In Brisbane with yourself, Canberra with, Gormo, Damo, Rick, and then Adelaide now with Sean Barris, who was about 5 or 6 years ahead of me, I think, as a specialist. So I was supported well by her, and then worked mostly with beach volleyball was my primary program.
Yeah. So how did that go? How did you manage to, was it pretty receptive to constraints, or how did you manage that environment?
Yeah, well, I say that was my primary program because the other program I was meant to work with didn't quite, well, probably I had coaches at two ends of the spectrum. I think I had, with beach volleyball, like a really open and keen and interested coach. And then at the other end, in another sport, I had a coach who wasn't really that interested, I think, in what I had to offer, or having me down there.
Yeah. So what's the challenges been skill acquisition specialist then
Yeah,
in
like I think that's the biggest one, right? It's forming connection with the coach and the program. I think like I hear coaches joke about, if you want to be a good coach, get good players. Like I think also part of it, if you want to be a good specialist, get good coaches too. Like because I think that is genuinely the biggest challenge of being a skill act specialist is forming connection, trust with coaches that then allows you to work with them alongside to do really good work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And some of the work with Georgia Askew's work around her PhD and some of Ross's stuff, obviously, and Sean, around creating an empathetic environment,
Mm,
working with coaches from where they are now,
yeah.
and being very careful about not coming in and saying, "Well, I know best," because you don't
Mm,
for a start. But also working from where they are and building on what their beliefs, understanding their beliefs, I think
yeah.
is a
And
crucial
And
process.
yeah, and I think like stepping back, like when I was in Canberra doing my PhD, I was really fortunate to live with a coach. He's gone on to coach at Olympics and World Championships, and I think that was actually a really like I didn't realize it at the time, but that was really pivotal for my development because I really learned to empathize with the coach. We'd get home at the end of the day and we'd just chat about what we'd been doing, and so you hear his broader frustrations, or you understand what he's working on, or what skillac means in the grand scheme of things. And so I think you develop a bit more self-awareness of we all think training design is the most important thing. It's important for sure, but coaches are also juggling a whole heap of other things, and they've got good reasons for why they're doing things. So I look back on that time spent living with coaches as really critical for that. um,
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes you might want to bring in some manipulations or some change, but it perhaps
mm.
isn't the moment sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Like I think I listened to the Rob Gray podcast, and I think you said it. It's evolution, not revolution, and like that's the perfect way to describe it. Accumulating small wins over time. That's what begins to build that trust, that credibility, essentially for the area and the discipline. And like I think I remember my first week with beach volleyball, and there was a coach there who had a little bit of exposure to skill act before. He'd done some readings. I think he'd even tried to listen to Rob Gray's podcast and stuff. So he's pretty keen. And I was just down there watching him my first week, and I watched him do this drill where he just stood on a platform and then just hit balls to his athletes, just and they
Yeah.
dig him out. And he did this for about 15 minutes straight at the end of practice. And, the athletes were in a line, they'd wait for their turn, and they'd get, 5 balls at them,
Yeah.
and then they'd go back in the line. And after the session, he wandered up to me and he was like, "So, Mick, what do you think about that activity?" And I knew he was like testing me, and I was like, "Oh no, like I've only seen like one or two of your session. Like I would need to see a lot more to understand it. Whereas obviously the skill act inside of me looking at something out of context is like, why would you do that? Like that's I don't understand that because you're removing all this key information and out removing all the context as we've spoken about. And so I just asked him, I'm like, well, why don't you tell me like what you thought about it and why you were doing it? And he's like, ah, glad you asked. He's like, see, I know there's limitations to that task. Like I know it's not the real thing, but I just do it for 10 minutes at the end because it allows me to control the difficulty for our athletes and they need to get some reps in on their digging. So I can be really targeted and specific with where the ball goes and allows them to work on some of their technique. And he's like, I'd be in trouble if I spent all my training doing that. But like 10 minutes at the end, he's like, I'm pretty happy. We get high reps in. I control the difficulties. Like it's an important drill for me.
So it comes back to intentions, doesn't it? Like what being very clear about what your intention is. And sometimes, I think this is often a misconception around representative learning design, isn't it? That, we talk about a dial of 1 to 10, with 10 being the real, the real thing. Does it look and feel like the real thing? But you can choose not to go to 10. That's the whole point about representative design, isn't it? But understand, actually, today I'm going to be happy down on a 4 or a 3, whatever rating he
Mm,
might have given that task. But I'm
mm,
doing it for a reason, because I want to my intention is to get more repetition without
yeah,
too much variation. So the
yeah.
representative links, repetition without repetition, or the level of without.
And I think that's one of the big misconceptions about representative design is that you need to play the game all the time, and you simply don't. Like you're just looking to sample the key interactions that you might be working on.
Yeah.
And I think it's not really feasible to play the game as well if you're trying to work on skill development too. Because if you think you're playing a team sport, you might only get 3 touches of the skill that you're actually trying to work on. Whereas like if you can get that dial to a modified task of, like a sub phase of a game or like something that's a 4 or a 5. It's like you can get a whole heap of repetitions in and it allows you to actually work on skill development.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Because you do need some, you don't get better without repetition. But I guess the key is to, what's the ratio of doing the same thing over and over again versus
Yeah,
varying it, and I like Ross's, like the way that he talked about repetition in table tennis of, the table tennis players tend to do the same shot, ba-dum, 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 as I call it, coaching.
yeah,
But once you can do 5 on the trot, what's the value in doing 20 to 30 or 40? So I'll do
yeah,
5, and I want to go 4 and 1, and then I want to go 3
yeah.
and 2. So
And I think that's where your task analysis becomes critical, like as an applied specialist working with a coach and programs, like actually taking the time to do a good task analysis of the skill you're working on. So like actually what are the key constraints and the key, performer environment interactions that you actually need to simulate if you are going to get transfer.
so you did that very well in the beach volleyball with a task analysis. How did you go about that? What did it look like?
Yeah. So this was we're looking at developing hand setting skill. We're just looking to actually understand, well, what are actually the factors that influence that? Because it's easy to get a whole heap of repetitions. I can just stand here and go boop, boop, boop. But we weren't really seeing a lot of transfer to the game through those kind of practice approaches. So, a task analysis, we're looking at what's happening, how is the ball coming to the person? Where does the ball go to from the person? What information might they use to understand and anticipate where the ball might be coming to them? What information might they use to actually inform their actions of where they might send the ball themselves?
Mm.
I think looking at what are the key interactions before, during, and after the activity, and thinking about how we can either recreate them or work towards having them in practice pretty quickly, because I think that's one of the challenges. Like there's no issues from me with non-representative tasks, but I think you're right, it's the ratio. And if your ratio is too much time in there, well, it's just not specific enough, right? Like you're just not going to get transfer. But you also have that conundrum with coaches sometimes too, is that just repetitions will get you better. Like if you do repetitions of something, they will get you better. So I think trying to figure out how quickly you can move away from that non-representative space into something like a little more challenging and something a little more specific, and then actually think about, well, all right, what does this task look like as you move the dial up and down? So if we want to remove representativeness, that's probably easy. But if we want to dial it up, how can we do it in a manner that will, I think, probably maintain the challenge point for the athlete? It won't be too overwhelming. It will be that gradual improvement. So we get transfer from task to task, knowing that I think the more tasks overlap, the more likely we are to get transfer. So I think that's where a ladder-based approach to task design and representativeness becomes really important. That we're not making these huge jumps from 3 to 7 on the dial, but we're going, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah. So I think when I work with coaches, I always try and encourage that. If you've got what would you give it? And there's no right or wrong, like based on the, basic idea of if we completely decouple, we're going down here. And I wouldn't be wanting to give that 5 or whatever. But if you've got a 3, can you turn it into a 5? If you've got a 5, can you turn it into a 7? What can I do? Right? And a lot of it's around context and that, isn't it? I think as well.
Yeah. And I think like Hodges and Lose, like the extension of the challenge point framework, I think that quadrant they've got is actually a really great tool for coaches and practitioners to just really quickly reflect on how your drill's going. Like, is it actually challenging enough that you're learning and that you're engaging your athletes, but also is it specific enough that it's going to transfer? And like I've used that tool heaps. I found it actually like a really easy one just to critically reflect against.
Tell me a bit more about that.
I don't know. Have you seen there, like on the horizontal axis you have specificity, and on the vertical axis you have challenge, basically. So if you're low challenge, low specificity, essentially like it's junk food drills, they're calling it. It's like that there's no nutrients to it. But if you're low challenge, high specificity, the idea is like it's probably more skill maintenance. But then if you go up into that top quadrant, it's moderate to high challenge with moderate to high specificity. Well, that's where your learning's occurring and you will get transfer.
Right. Yeah, sounds good. Have you done any work with junior athletes as part of the program, or have they always been in the high performance? Is it sort of 18 plus or?
Yeah, mostly in the senior athlete space, not a lot in the junior space.
When people come in to your programs, so at the bottom end, they make a national squad or they make the development team or whatever. What's some of the key things that you notice from how the junior program or how the junior system has helped prepare them for this level? Well, is there any general reflections, or is it just too individual to sort of say?
It's generally quite individual, I think, and it depends where they've come from.
Right.
Some of the challenges historically, though, have been all of a sudden, I think, as you step up into the seniors, you're given a lot more autonomy and potentially freedom. Maybe not freedom, but you're given gradual autonomy and input into what you want to work on, how you're going to go about it. You're given this ownership, and that's probably something I think that is quite funny. I think because if you think about development of from kids into adults, it's like you have a whole heap of autonomy as a kid. You're so great at designing backyard games, like kids probably do it better than anyone else. And then I think as you progress, you kind of lose that skill and maybe lose the confidence to do that. But then you get sometimes into these more senior programs, and you've got to find that confidence again. You've got to find that skill again to actually take some ownership of your own learning and lead with some input into what you want to work on and how you might go about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a real interest in how the connection of junior programs fit with the high performance world. And I know from some of my experiences, there's some of the high performance people who run the high performance, that's got nothing to do with us. They're completely separate. But for me, it should be a seamless fit. It should be a seamless, like they should come into this level ready, as
Yeah.
much as they can, and obviously the speeds maybe have to go up, the
Mm.
way that the game's played is more powerful or faster or whatever. But if we design the junior games well enough, that leap wouldn't be so massive. But that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Like the co-creation goes away, the autonomy goes away through your teenage years, and then you've got to find a way of getting it back again. We've had that
Yeah.
inquiry, that exploration knocked out of us that we've had inherently from being little. We call it, you're an active perceiver, aren't you? And then we become a passive receiver. And what you're saying,
Mm.
interestingly, is you've got to go back to being an active perceiver again and taking control of your own world a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think today, like, good coaches know that the motivational climate is actually really important and really, really critical too. And part of that is providing, athletes with opportunities for autonomy and input and things like that. And so a lot of coaches are doing those things now and doing good jobs of that. And but sometimes it takes a while for new athletes to develop the confidence, I think, to actually say this is what I think, or I'm just going to have a crack at this myself.
Yeah. So that's maybe a message for coaches of older teenagers who are feeding into the structure, is to try and encourage that, and try and invite the players by giving them more autonomy. And we certainly, something that's really interested me over time has been that motivational constraint and how we coach. It's
Mm,
almost, some people seem, SDT as part of constraints, which
yeah,
clearly it's not, but it fits really nicely, I
yeah.
think.
And it's a challenge too, because sometimes when you want to give them more autonomy, like I don't think anyone would, like there probably wouldn't be many that would disagree that it's a good idea, but it can be really challenging to implement because if athletes don't necessarily have the skills or confidence, all of a sudden you're giving them this autonomy, like with a volleyball example, like we wanted the athletes to actually start thinking a little bit more tactically on the court, and part of that involved we let them design some of the first games in the warm up. So they actually had to think about a game to work on a particular element of a skill. And, the first day they came in, they didn't want to do it. So the coach, sat with them and helped them design it. Then the next day they came in with their own design, but like the coach and I both looked at each other and like we're like, well, this is not going to work. But like we'll just let them go ahead and kind of learn that lesson.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A couple of years ago, I did within my skill like unit with the PE lot at QUT. They were in a group of five. They had to come up with their own backyard game, their own striking and fielding games. So it didn't have to be cricket; it could be baseball, softball, whatever. Um, and at the end of it, I said, you've got to rate the game on how much buzz it created. So how much did it excite you? How much did it get you like really engaged? And I went round in one group and they did this little activity. And I said, well, there's five of you, top marks 25. What would you give it? 11. You're designing your own game here and you're making a game that's boring. So we got into a really interesting discussion actually about how much kids today are making backyard games and going out. And it was quite, I mean, they all still did it. They all still went out and played, but I don't think as much as previous generations had done. And my view on that is it's not because they don't want to, is there's just so much organized, formalized sport that they don't have time to do it.
Yeah,
Saw a
absolutely.
lot of it in lockdown during COVID. There was a lot of free play again. But when you're taking in, if you're living in Melbourne or in a big city, it can take you an hour to get there. You train for an hour and then it takes you an hour to get home. There's not much time to play. So that's maybe a societal issue rather than the kids don't
Mm,
want to play. Maybe they just don't get the
mm,
chance to play. But
mm.
that's another issue.
Yeah, constraints
So
on development. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So where are you? You moved on from Sassy back up to Canberra.
Yeah,
What are you
so
doing?
back to Canberra. So I was a practitioner for a little bit, a full-time skill acquisition specialist working with a couple of different programs, athletics, gymnastics, and basketball. Before then transitioning into the current role that I am now of the tools.
Yeah, which is tell us what that is.
Yeah, so it's essentially trying to support our network of skill acquisition practitioners in Australia. So we're really lucky in the sense that we've got a network of 16 practitioners right now. About I think 6 or 7 of them have almost full-time employment in Australia in the Olympic Paralympic sporting system, and then the other half rather part-time or doing apprenticeships in terms of their PhDs and might be doing some support with sports a day a week or as part of their PhD study. So my kind of role is to try and connect them all and identify common development themes or needs or also chat with our sports around the country as well around potential resourcing and how they could go about that as well for skill-ac related problems.
Is there any hot topic that you can share with us, or is it all confidential at this point in time?
No,
Anything?
nothing's too confidential. Like I think I think we're very fortunate in Australia to have um as many employed specialists in the system as we do. I don't think there's any countries that actually have that. So straight away, I think that allows us a certain amount of liberty in how we practice, is that we can move a bit slower, we can take our time to build relationships and form connections, and we don't have to impact quickly to get more funding, or if we're a consultant coming in and out, we don't have to just make sure we do something on this day and then leave. It's like we actually have the time to embed ourselves in programs and understand the socio-cultural context, form those relationships with the coaches, and build that trust, which I think is proving to be a foundation of our practice.
Brilliant. Okay. Um, anything else we've missed that you'd want to talk about? Or,
I think one of the things we're working through at the moment is building a profile of what a good skill acquisition specialist looks like, and it's kind of built off some of the conversations we're having in our network at the moment, where we have a lot of our younger practitioners in our network who are just starting their careers or a couple of years into their careers, and so really understanding what are the skills and things like that that they need to develop. And one of the things we've got in there is that's probably our hot topic to answer your
yeah.
previous question around how do you develop as a skill act specialist? How do you work within the constraints of your institute or your sport to actually begin to establish yourself? And everyone's got that motor learning skill act knowledge, but as we sort of spoke about earlier, being able to apply it is a whole different kettle of fish and requires a whole different set of skills that you didn't necessarily learn at uni. So we're sort of working through trying to figure out what that actually looks like, what's needed. And I think one of the things in the knowledge section of that I think we're going to put in is you need to understand the constraints based framework. And I've begun floating at that with people who are potentially not as constraint minded, and it's getting traction with people, because I think not necessarily as I use it as a pedagogical tool myself, but I probably use it more as a framework to guide my thinking, and as I go into environments to understand why athletes are behaving the way they are. um, I think as a framework, I actually think, which is how Newell originally intended it, right? I actually think it's actually critical knowledge for practitioners, not just skill act, but I think any practitioners in sport, to be able to have a framework like that to guide your thinking of why you're seeing the behavior that you're seeing from athletes.
Yeah. So you're saying that's been received reasonably well, or like
So
within the
far,
system?
so
That's
far.
good. Yeah,
Yeah, like
because
I
I
think.
know there's a real worry of not trying to come in and impose a way of doing things on people.
Yeah, and that's it too. Like we're looking to be theoretically agnostic because we want to encourage diversity into our network. We want more people from different backgrounds and different unis to be able to connect in with us and be a part of what we're doing because motor learning and skill acquisition is a diverse field. Um, but I do think having some knowledge and experience using constraints as a framework for thinking. I think so, rather than as a pedagogical tool. Like I actually think it's really critical, and it's probably one of the things that's most positively influenced my practice is using that as a reflective tool or a self or an assessment tool.
Yeah, and the pick and mix idea that you can just pick bits from each of them. I think for those anybody listening, go onto the website, and Keith did a brilliant piece around the dangers of pick and mix, and philosophically, and you're coming at it from different angles.
Mm.
We've heard people say, "Oh, well, it's just all the same, really." Variability is still important, whichever. But I think, deep down, there is different reasons and different philosophical
Yeah,
reasons.
yeah, and I've been trying to challenge myself on that a little bit lately because um, like just through exposure to yourself and Keith in my formative years, like I have adopted a ecological dynamics perspective or behavioral dynamics, whatever you want to call it. And like with those conversations that are occurring, I'm trying to challenge myself a bit to, I think, justify to myself why. And what I mean, these thoughts are still emergent. But like where I've kind of landed is I actually think like as a framework rather than a pedagogical theory, like I actually think as a framework it provides the most complete understanding of human movement, and we're kind of in the business of human movement. And I think to me, motor learning and skill acquisition is actually a really like diverse area with like lots of
Yep.
theories, approaches, and things. And it's really difficult to actually make sense of how all these things can work together or plug in and go together. And that's actually where I found ecological dynamics, behavioral dynamics. Like I've found that actually incredibly useful as a framework for my own sense making because I think it is the most complete framework to understand human movement.
Yeah. In the end, you've got to be able, I think you made a really good point there, is that you need to be able to explain the why. Why am I doing it, what I'm doing? And whichever approach you're doing, if you can do that, then that's a great start, I think.
Mm.
And I think, the call for being a little bit more um, theoretically based will strengthen practice anyway, but um, there is obviously a clear challenge to us all on trying to explain that, which is why this podcast exists and our website exists, and our books exist. We're trying to bridge
Mm.
that gap between theory
Mm.
and language of academia and explain it so that coaches can use it, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I think my journey is at an end for tonight. We'll better go and see if we're still getting bashed by any wins. And thanks for your time, Mike. That was brilliant. Good to catch up again. And I'm sure we'll be talking pretty soon anyway, offline.
Yes, sounds good. Thanks for having me in, and hopefully stay safe from the cyclone.
Thanks, matey. Okay. Um, cheers. Don't go anywhere. Just stop.